I'm Paul, and I'm the leader of the energy project at YE. I've been working for about like a year now, and this is the sixth episode of a webinar series about energy and energy policy. And today I'm quite excited to tackle a topic that I think is not discussed sufficiently. We're talking about new renewable energy target all the time, and we don't necessarily know what goes behind. So after talking about raw critical materials, we're now investigating how this is impacting biodiversity. Um, I will introduce our speaker in a second. First, I wanted to mention for the few who are in the chat with us right now, the Generation Climate Europe, that's another youth organization, and they are making a survey. They're trying to find data on how energy prices in the European Union has affected young people. And this is very precious data because it's going to be fueling some policy recommendation, which they will then share with policy decision makers, sorry. So if you have a moment, the link is in the chat. This is very, very important data that will be then used for put to good use. Right, so let's start right into it with a bit of an overview what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to start with an introduction, trying to frame what the problem is and why we're even talking about this subject right now. I will then yield the floor to Alex, who's also working at YE, and he's a bit of our biodiversity expert. And he's going to be talking about Natura 2000 areas and why they are relevant and why we're even talking about them in this webinar. And then I will also give the floor to Michiel to talk about like how the recent Repower EU legislation package is kind of crashing with the biodiversity framework. And then finally, we have a fourth part, which is supposed to be hosted by Pietro, who is the working assistant on the energy project, but he hasn't connected yet, so I hope he will be joining us throughout the webinar. And when his part is going to try to give us a bit of a good news and see how there are ways to optimize our renewable energy production and see how this actually can positively impact biodiversity. So without further ado, let's go on with the introduction. I'm going to try to make it brief because this is not the center of this presentation. But I thought it was important to give a bit of context. So obviously, it's quite known now that energy is an issue. It is responsible for about 60% of the world's greenhouse gases and thus a major driver of climate change. And one of the major challenges of this decade and the one to come is to find a way to switch from these fossil fuel-based electricity generation and energy in general towards more sustainable alternatives. So the two graphs that I've put here kind of show the way that the International Energy Agency sees the short-term development of renewable energy. And I kind of wanted to just show this as a bit of a context. So what we can see here is that in 2023, all renewable sources combined amount for about 30% of our electricity production. And I really insist on electricity because this is different than the global energy mix. Electricity only amounts for about 20% of the entire energy we're using. So of this 20%, in 2023, there was already 30% that was made from low carbon and renewable energy sources. The perspective of the International Energy Agency is that this percentage is going to go up to 41% within 4 years, which is quite huge. And as you can see, the main increase is in solar and wind capacity. So this production was very short term simply because it is actually very difficult to accurately predict how the electricity mix of the different states is going to change over the years, simply because it depends on a lot of factors, such as the extent with which energy efficiency will be invested in, meaning whether or not we're going to have new technologies that are less energy consuming, whether states are going to actually engage in energy sufficiency, meaning that certain uses will simply be terminated, whether we're going to use electric vehicles, whether we're going to produce hydrogen. All of this makes it particularly complicated to accurately say how much of renewable green energy we're going to have in 30 years. So this is not a prediction, it is a scenario. This is the scenario of also the IEA. And as you can see in their scenario, they foresee a massive increase of solar, wind, bioenergy. And this is why these are the two principal sources that we're going to be talking about this today. First, because they are the one who will be growing the fastest, and secondly, because they are the one who can be pretty much used everywhere, compared to, for instance, geothermal or hydro, which needs certain geographical elements. The first issue that we can see when we are talking about renewable energy and their impact on biodiversity is the question of land use. So this seems maybe a bit of a complex graph, but let me run it through with you shortly. The way this graphic is made is to try to show how much land is needed to produce 1 megawatt of electricity with a certain source of energy. And so the higher it goes, the more land you need for the same amount of output. And so what I'm trying to show here is that if you can see at the very, very bottom of the list are gas plants. And so gas plant is so far one of the largest fossil fuel-based ways to produce energy, and so electricity. And what I'm trying to say here is that if we switch from, let's say, gas to solar photovoltaic that are installed on the ground, then we are multiplying the total surface that we need for the same output by almost 20, which is huge. And this is why it has to be taken into account when defining future energy policies. And the other thing that is interesting with this graph is that you can see that one similar technology, let's say photovoltaic, depending on the raw material it's using, whether it is silicon or cadmium, doesn't have exactly the same square mileage per megawatt. So there are ways to go around the issue of land use, and it is very much based on the type of technology that we are trying to implement. Here, I wanted to also show, because it wasn't in the previous graph, the same thing with wind energy. And what we can see here is that with wind energy, it's more complex. First, because the difference between the minimum and the maximum square footage that is required to produce a certain output varies greatly, again, depending on the technology that's being used, because there are different sizes of windmills. And they can be used, as you can see, onshore and offshore, and that also really greatly impacts the amount of land that is used. Finally, we're talking biofuels, and this is extremely important because the share of biofuels that are being used is rapidly increasing, and this can become a bit of a problem if we don't do it properly. Biofuels are basically fuels that are used either for electricity or for general consumption. And they are all fully based on biomass, which means like natural biodegradable elements. And the main issue that they are presenting is either land use or direct or indirect land use. And I wanted to really introduce these two notions because I think they are relevant. The direct land use is the idea that you have a natural habitat, either forest or peatland, which is thriving with a biodiversity, and then you dry it out, cut down the trees to put cropland instead in order to grow certain crops that will then be used to produce fuels. And if you don't do it this way, then you can do it indirectly, which is by using a land that is already used for crops, but that is instead of the crops being used for human or for cattle's feeding, then you turn it into a land for biofuel production. And that means that we either lose a bit of production, agricultural production for us, or we destroy another natural habitats in order to create more croplands. So yeah, that's why biofuel is an issue and why we have to pay attention to it. And just to end this as a sort of an overall overview, sorry, of the problem in general, because of the technology and because of the land that it's needed, the development of renewable energy can have a severe impact on biodiversity. If we're talking about like windmills or water dams, for instance, it can disrupt migratory routes and can prevent certain fish from reproducing. It directly destroys natural habitats. The construction or the renovation of it, whether it is onshore or offshore, can create a significant noise pollution. Under certain circumstances, it can also introduce invasive species. It displaces population with biofuel, which requires a lot of water. It necessarily leads to water shortages, and this is overall why we are talking about this right now. It's because we have increasing target for renewable energy production, which is absolutely crucial for our climate change fight. But the way we do it is also very important because it could have severe negative impacts that we cannot understate. And so now we're trying to see a bit of a potential solution. And one of them is obviously to create a protective area. And so I wanted to ask you, Alex, if you could talk to us about this protected area and how they function, because they are quite an important tool in order to ensure that biodiversity remains protected.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So basically, yeah, the concept of EU biodiversity law comes into play here, which imagine that it has been a concept that we've been seeing from the 70s, and now with all the pressures coming, especially from the renewable energy expansion, I think it becomes more relevant than ever. Also, I discovered just today how to put videos on Canva, so you'll see quite some videos. So I want to ask a question to the audience, basically. What do you think we mean when we say EU biodiversity law? Are you familiar with any legislation that you think would comprise biodiversity law? You can either unmute your mic or throw a comment in the chat.
Can I?
Yes, Adriana.
Hi. The Habitats Directive.
Yes, exactly. So we have.
Or,
Mhm.
and since we have a bird on the screen, the Birds Directive, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. These are exactly the two I was looking for. So, okay, if we go to the next slide, we will see that it is exactly what Staviana mentioned. So we have the Birds Directive from 1979 and the Habitats Directive from 1992. And together they are called the Nature Directives. Yeah, perfect. Next slide, please. And yeah, just a screenshot of how basically the legislation looks to remind everyone that we're talking about a legal document that it's accessible for everyone to see in the European Commission website. And yeah, just this idea to be put into people's minds. And at the same time, to mention the nature restoration law, which was just adopted a few months ago, in October, if I'm correct. I think at this point it can also be said to comprise EU biodiversity law. But for the purposes of today's presentation, we're not really gonna delve into it, but just to mention that it is a very recently adopted law. It was really hard to get its final adoption through because of pressures from different blocs in Europe. And it has to do with different targets, from increasing the amount of pollinators, such as bees, to restoring the river flow of rivers, like removing barriers, and quite a few more. I think something will be coming up from YEE soon on this, so stay tuned for that. But yeah, going to the next slide, and basically the two nature directives. So as Tavriana said, the Birds Directive and the Habitats Directive establish a network of protected areas, which cover about 17% of European land area. In this map, you can see indicated as blue these sites, which are called Natura 2000 sites. I assume most of you must have heard of them. They are everywhere. Like, as you see also in this map, there can be one very near your house. And in this website that is included on this site, you can basically zoom in the map if you're interested to see what Natura 2000 sites there are near your home. And then it's interesting to think what exactly happens within these Natura 2000 areas. If you could go to the next slide, please, Paul. So this is an example of the Natura 2000 area actually that's closest to my home, and this is my dog in the picture. And it's funny to think how, so the Habitats Directive essentially protects habitats and at the same time the species hosted in it. And the Birds Directive adds up to those species. And into just this area, for example, there can be found more than 10 habitat types, which are very interesting to read. Yeah, what exactly happens in the local nature around you and the reason why this should be protected. And if you go to the next slide, we will see that there is actually a very high number, 2,000 species that have been identified by the EU and 230 habitat types, which are basically protected from this Natura 2000 network. Next slide, please. So it is very sad to realize that the unfavorable conservation status is for the vast majority of habitats, 85%, and for also the majority of species, 63%. Yeah, which shows that if you remember the dates, we have the Birds Directive from 1979, if I'm correct, and the Habitats Directive from 1992, and we are now in 2024, and we've come a long way, but we have yet to see biodiversity really, biodiversity levels really going up again. And with the current pressures that there are, for example, from renewable energy, as Paul mentioned, this can get quite conflicting. And if you go to the next slide, we will see that the Habitats Directive has a specific article, since what is it exactly that these sites need to be protected from? Well, from human interference, above all, that can cause ecological depletion. So whenever there is a plan or a project that does not have to do with the management of the site, so it does not have to do with something that would, for example, improve the ecological status of a species or the habitat, then there needs to be an assessment under Article 6. If you go to the next slide, please, Paul, we will see that this assessment is for significant effects of plans or projects. Now, you can think what can be considered a plan. For example, the new plan of where to deploy renewable energy that countries need to do in a national level. Or, for example, a renewable energy project. Or it can be farming, it can be different agriculture practices, it can be the operation of a beach bar, for example, in the beach, in the image that we just saw before. So whenever there is such a plan or project proposed, there needs to be an assessment. Now, this happens even if this is outside the Natura 2000 area. So say that the beach bar wants to be built in the sand 50 meters away from where the Natura 2000 area starts. If there is the likelihood of significant effects being on the Natura 2000 site, it still needs to go under this assessment. At the same time, it also is the case for the renewal of pre-existing permits. So if this beach bar was already there before the site was designated as a Natura 2000 site, there can still be an assessment for its effects on the site when it comes to its re-permitting. And there needs to be certainty beyond reasonable scientific doubt about about these effects. So there needs to be a quite high level of certainty to be able to allow such a project or plan to continue, so that there is the absence of significant effects of this project in the Natura 2000 area. Okay, next slide, please. But there is an exception to this. It has been interpreted quite strictly. For this exception to be able to be put in place and used so that you derogate this clause and you can still go ahead with your project, means that this project should have no alternatives. So for example, if we talk about energy, you could see between, okay, we have a wind farm. What about if we had a solar farm, for example? There need to be imperative reasons of overriding public interest in place, which could be either social or economic. We will see about energy, how much it falls within this category. And at the same time, there need to be compensation measures taken. Say, for example, that again, this beach bar is built, and they need to make sure that they will minimize the impact and make sure that they make up for any possible damage that could happen in the area. And if you go to the next slide, we will see that the first one then had to do more with habitats, as well as species to some extent. But yeah, basically, if you want to make any new project or plan. But at the same time, there is Article 12, which talks for a prohibition of a disturbance or killing of species. So this applies to the species protection. And the contents of this, we will see on the next slide, are, it is a very, very strict system. And this killing or disturbance needs to be deliberate. When we say deliberate, it has been interpreted as the mere likelihood of the killing happening. So, for example, a wind turbine would amount to that, thinking that it could kill a bird, very simply. And we have some cases, the cricketus cases. The cricketus is the Latin name for the European hamster. And you see the image of a hamster here. And basically, they have to do with some cases that showed the developers wanted to, for example, I think if I'm correct, one of them was like a big mall, and they could not build it because it was found that there was the European hamster nesting in that area, which seems maybe a bit funny. How could a hamster stop an entire construction site happening? But very luckily, the court did uphold the law in a strict manner. And this was even the case in a place where the hamster used to live, had left, but there was the possibility that they could go back there and use it as a resting or reproductive site. So the court was quite strict once again. When I say the court, I mean the Court of Justice of the European Union. But if you go to the next slide, we will see that as with the project, there are also derogations when it comes to this. So you can basically kill or disturb an animal if there are no alternatives, if it does not amount to a problem when maintaining a favorable population. And again, if we have these imperative reasons of overriding public interest, again, like of an economic or a social nature. So yeah, we see that this is the system that has been created under the nature directives. So we have to be careful when we allow projects. We have to be careful when when there is any activity that can result in the killing or disturbance of some species. And yeah, this can lead to basically some conflicts when we have all these renewable energy targets, on which Michiel will elaborate now.
Michiel,
Yes, so I will.
I forgot to introduce you at the beginning. I'm very sorry. So please introduce yourself. And I wanted to personally thank you for attending this webinar.
No problem. It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. It's a really interesting topic that I really like. So yeah. So thanks, Alex, for explaining the nature directives. It saves me some time. I will just quickly explain why the nature directives are considered as a very strict regime, also regarding renewable energy projects. Many people criticize the nature directives because of the case law of the Court of Justice and national courts. They interpret, they have a really strict standard of review on all the provisions of these directives. For example, regarding Article 6.3 of the Habitats Directive, the courts states that there has to be no reasonable scientific doubt that there will be no significant effects, which is a very strict standard. And for example, under the bird directive, sometimes the provisions on the prohibition of deliberate killing are applied at the individual specimen of the species that can be concerned, which is obviously very, very strict. Also regarding renewable energy projects, you can imagine a wind turbine. It will almost always kill a few individuals, even though sometimes its effects will not be significant. Also regarding the derogations are very strictly interpreted. And even though there is a potential way for renewable energy projects to be understood as being in the overriding public interest due to their contribution to climate mitigation, this has not been accepted by all the courts. And some courts state that this is only acceptable for very big renewable energy projects that have a really big impact on climate mitigation. So many project developers and many renewable energy companies were criticizing the nature directives because they were too strict and weren't taking into account the sustainable aspect of their projects, because their projects obviously contribute to mitigating climate change, which is also beneficial for nature, since nature also suffers from climate change. And also nature and renewable energy projects have actually a similar impact, because nature absorbs carbon emissions, which also mitigates climate change. So there is a synergy. And so the EU tried to do something about this, and adopted the Repower EU plan, which is now a directive that came into force recently. Regarding renewable energy projects, there are two sets of rules. So first of all, there's a distinct set of rules for renewable energy projects that will be built in renewable acceleration areas. These are very big areas in which the renewable projects that will be built will have to comply. I mean, will benefit from derogations to the nature directives, which can be quite significant, as I will explain. And these areas are also quite big, because they have to contribute to the objective of the EU, which is for every country to have a big share of renewable energy production. These areas, they have to be subject to an appropriate assessment, which is the assessment that has to be done following Article 6.3 of the Habitat Directive that Alex already presented. And it has also has to be subject to strategic environmental impact assessments. And also this area for the selection of these areas, member states have to avoid environmentally sensitive areas and have to really focus on already built areas and artificial areas. What can be seen as a problem is that the environmental assessment of these very big areas is only limited at plan level. So this means that there is only an assessment of the environmental impact of the projects that will be in the area on the plan level, and not for each project that will later be built in it. So this is quite a problem, because if you do not do an assessment for each project, there is also a likelihood that there might be some gaps in the impact assessments. And it could be that once all the projects have been built in the area, there are environmental impacts that we did not expect. Yeah, appropriate assessments are an exception in this regime for projects. So appropriate assessments for projects are an exception, and there will only be an appropriate assessment for specific projects if it's proven that there is a high likelihood of significant effects on the environment created by those projects, which is a very high standard of proof, which is very difficult to prove, especially because the time in which you have to screen for environmental impacts of these projects is very short. It is now either 45 days or 30 days for small renewable energy projects. So most of the time there will be no appropriate assessment for renewable energy projects. So as you can see, for renewable energy projects inside of these renewable acceleration areas, the permitting rules are becoming quite lenient regarding the environmental impact assessments and the appropriate assessments. For renewable projects that will be built outside of these big areas, the Commission has a more balanced standpoint. And the derogations are that the main derogations are that for the exceptions under Article 6.4 and 9 of the Article 6.4 of the Habitat Directive and Article 9 of the Bird Directive, all killing, as long as appropriate mitigation measures have been taken, will not be considered as deliberate, which means that the killing of animals will be considered as acceptable. And there was another exception, but I think I forgot it. I have a gap in my head, but whatever, it's not important. So as you can see, the rules inside of renewable acceleration areas will be quite lenient, and outside of it, in my opinion, they will be not lenient enough to really create a change, because outside of these areas, renewable projects will still have to comply to most of the rules. And regarding the derogations under Article 6.4 and 9, there are, for each of these potential, I mean, if you want to have a derogation under these provisions, you need to comply to 3 conditions, and it's only one of these conditions that has been made more lenient for these projects. So it won't change much, in my opinion. Now, even though one might question if nature might not be impacted too much by these changes, I think it is justified that the REPowerEU directive creates more leniency for renewable energy projects, because obviously climate mitigation is one of the objectives of the EU. In the case law of the Court of Justice and of the courts in member states, when applying these directives, these nature directives, the focus is too much on environmental protection, and the courts in their evaluation of these projects, they never actually, or very rarely, take into account the contribution of these projects to climate mitigation. It is very strict, and it does not take into account the sustainable aspect of these projects. So in my opinion, it's still a good thing, even though it has to be done properly, as Paul said earlier. So yeah, this is more or less what I had to say on this topic.
So just do I understand correctly, in your opinion, and from having like studied this legislation, you still think that the EU is still being too stringent, and eventually the extent with which these renewable energy projects are being framed is getting in the way of a proper development of renewable energy? You think that we should be more lenient and like make it still easier?
It is too strict inside of renewable acceleration areas, because there is almost no assessment of the impact of the projects themselves. So taking into account the fact that these areas are very big, that often in Europe, which is a densely populated continent, the areas where these renewable acceleration areas will be also very close to Natura 2000 sites. I think that it's quite risky to not impose project-specific assessments. But outside of these areas, where we will still need lots of renewable energy projects to achieve our goals regarding climate mitigation, I think they were not strict enough, because the only exceptions will not really change anything. So the outside of the renewable acceleration areas, the only new rules that have been decided upon are that that all renewable energy projects will be considered as being in the overriding public interest, which won't change much, because that's only one element that has to be proven in order to have a derogation from the strict regime of the nature directives. And also that that if appropriate mitigation measures are taken, there will be no deliberate killing anymore. Even though there is killing, it will be seen as acceptable as long as appropriate mitigation measures are taken. But to prove that you have taken appropriate mitigation measures, you still need to do studies on, the potential impacts of your installations on species, which can be very extensive. And that is already something that's being complained about today, and which is already like making permitting procedures very long. And also, the REPowerEU directive didn't change anything on the interpretation of certain provisions of the nature directives, which are interpreted very strictly by the Court of Justice. So it is double. On one hand, you have very big renewable acceleration areas, which will probably also have an impact on the species inside of Natura 2000 sites or other environmentally protected areas, because of how densely populated some countries are. I mean, look at Belgium, the Netherlands. Those are countries, if you have Natura 2000 sites very close to cities. If you allow fast permitting procedures without proper environmental assessments for renewable energy projects right next to Natura 2000 sites, you will have problems on the long term, in my opinion. But on the other hand, outside of these areas, in my opinion, it's not strict enough. There won't be much change.
Okay. There is a question that comes to mind. I'm not actually sure if any of you have the answer to this, but the life impact assessment, I don't know. Do you know who has to carry it out? Is it the company itself who is mandated to assess the impact of its own project, or is there like a third party who's committed to do it for them? I don't know if Alex, you know about this.
Yeah, it's the developer. The developer has the burden basically of completing the assessments and indicating that there will be no significant effect or no deliberate killing, or that it falls under the derogations.
Okay. Great. I saw that Pietro joined us. So Pietro, I'm gonna yield the floor for you for that last aspect. It's meant kind of a bit of a good news. I wanted to after really emphasizing how detrimental renewable energy can be to biodiversity. I also wanted to be fair and to show some concrete examples of the positive impact. The main one being obviously that we mentioned the reduction of our carbon footprint, which is absolutely and massively important. But there is also some other impacts that are not always very well known. So Pietro, if you want to go ahead.
Yes. The only thing is, can I ask you to give me screen sharing rights, because it's quite a few slides, so it's much easier if I can move through them.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's not the person that's speaking. Yeah, I guess it's the same because it's for everyone.
So I'll let you share then. Oh.
Okay.
And in the meantime, I just wanted to really emphasize for those in the chat, if you have any questions, maybe sometimes we kind of gone through something very fast. There was a lot of information, and so if you have any questions, really don't hesitate to ask them.
Okay. So I guess everyone should see it right now, hopefully.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you again for being here. This is like a final brief overview of some other, positive aspect or just more practical implementation of renewable energy infrastructure that's interesting to consider. So the first thing I want to look at is the fact that when it comes to offshore wind farms, but in general, actually energy installation, here I will be talking about wind farms because that's research that I've been looking on has been done on this, but it actually applies to any sort of offshore energy, renewable energy installation. And important, there are a lot of nice and positive implication for the wildlife that live within the areas in which those structures are built. It's true that, of course, there is a certain degree of perturbation of the local environment, but if things are done right, the negative effects can actually be offset. So that's what we will talk about. So to start, whenever we put something in the ocean or in water, we have to face the problem of scouring. Scouring. Yes, pronunciation is not the best, but you get the idea. Especially the main problem is that underwater there are currents, and currents move sand or soil away, meaning that if I insert deep a pillar into the ground, over time the seabed material around the structure might be pushed away by hydrodynamic forces, and this can result in sediment reduction of around also up to 10 meters, which in practice, as you can see here, means that the foundation around the pillar starts to be eroded. So this is something you need to take care of whenever you do any sea installation. Now, how you solve this? With scouring protections, which slow down water currents and allow for suspended particulate matter to settle, and so essentially reduce the likelihood that this kind of holes will create around the pillar supporting infrastructure. Now, this is of course very technical. It's not really related to what we're talking about today, but it's very interesting because these structures themselves are actually create what are called reef effects. So basically they offer hard artificial surfaces that can then be colonized by marine organisms. And so by creating living space for marine organism, there is the possibility to boost wildlife and increase biodiversity within the area in which those installations are planted. Because of course, these structures are usually planted on flat seabeds, which don't have much of those hard surfaces that many living organisms need. So they attract marine life for 3 reasons. First, because they provide shelter from predation and from water movements. Also because they they expand feeding grounds. They create new feeding grounds from which they can obtain their nutrition, of course. And finally, and this is also very important, they can also act as points of reference for spatial orientation. And yeah, I think that's quite cool, because especially the third one, I didn't really think about it. Now, the question is, how are these spaces colonized? That's very easy. It can be either through migration from the surrounding substrate, or just by settling of the larvae within. Now, however, not all scouring protections are born equal. So some of them can create more habitat space than others. And this is very important, because of course we have to remember that once you put on the ground some scouring protection, you are removing some habitat in the first place. So these structures can expand the habitable space for living creatures only when the space removed is less than the space added. And with this in mind, here I have a few different types of reef protection, and you can see that reef balls, which are actually structures that are used as to foster, to induce reef effects, even outside of the context of anti-scouring protection. Sometimes reef balls are planted to begin with on their own. They can create a lot more habitat than they require to be installed. You can see, for example, that 3,000 square meters of habitat are created, while 452 are lost. So it's a net gain of more than 3,000 square meters of habitat space. It's not the same for everyone. For example, synthetic fronds, they actually lead to a habitat loss. So this positive effect of scouring protections only come when the right scouring devices are used. Now, there is a question, however, and this is something where further research needs to be done to understand to what extent the reef effects induced by scouring protections are actually something we should look for or something positive. Because of course, there is always the question of whether the increase in biolife, marine life around those scouring structures is caused by by the creation of new biomass, or simply to the reallocation of already existing one. So this is something, of course, that further research needs to look into this, because it's important, because of course the effects are decidedly different if there is no new biomass created. Now, another reason because of which offshore energy installations can promote and facilitate the another reason why we should consider offshore energy infrastructure when it comes to its positive effects with respect to wildlife is because they can actually also create what are called sanctuary areas. To understand this, we need to take a step back and understand that today most of the fishing is done through a technique called trolling, which basically means catching fish by throwing by towing a very big fish net across the marine sea. Depending on where this fish is dragged, whether at the bottom and the beetle or in higher parts of depending on the depth of the net, of course, the practice changes, also the impact changes. But the point is that trolling has a lot of negative consequences on marine biolife, because it reduces biomass. It leads to disrupting changes that can undermine the equilibrium of local ecosystems, because by destroying biomass, it leads to the survival of some species, but not of others, which in turn then can lead to changes in the equilibriums of local ecosystems. And also, it's being one of the most used practices for fishing is also, of course, a root cause for the overexploitation of marine fish stocks. So it's a problematic practice that has led the creation of what are called no trolling zones. So marine protected areas in which the extraction of living and non-living resources is just permanently prohibited. Now, how does this connect to our discourse about renewables? It's actually super simple. So you cannot troll everywhere, of course, because if you have big pieces of steel, of concrete, big pillars, your nets might get stuck. So usually around offshore energy installations, there are anti-entanglement requirements that prevent fishers from actually going there and fishing through trolling. Now, of course, this is a practical requirement to prevent damaging the infrastructure, to ensure safety of the fishers themselves, but it de facto creates no trolling zones around offshore wind farms. So once we combine this with the increased living space that scouring protection provides, we again create environments where marine life can thrive. Now, however, the question is which marine life thrives, of course. So while these are positive effects, constant monitoring is needed to ensure that the living creatures that populate these areas are the local ones and not invasive organisms that are not part of the ecosystem, and so whose presence might actually do more harm than good. So this is something that should be monitored in general when creating those establishments. Now, I think this is very interesting because most of a way in which invasive species spread is through, of course, marine shipping. And in Fécamp in Normandy, there is on the one hand the port of Le Havre, and on the other a very big offshore wind farm. They're being built one next to the wind farm is being built right next to the port. So I think it will be very interesting once the wind farm is completed to see whether any possible invasive species that might be brought by the ships that arrive at the port ends up colonizing the wind farm. But this is, for example, that we need to wait some time to see because only time can tell. Now, briefly, because I guess we are almost over. Now, I want to look at another important challenge that comes with renewable energy, which is land use. Of course, because both to produce sustainable energy and to produce food, we need land. And sometimes we don't have enough to do both at the same time. And so we should probably use it. We need to increase the efficiency of both when it comes to agriculture and when it comes to energy production to ensure that we have the space we need to produce everything. And a way we can do this is through co-production, meaning essentially producing food where we produce energy and producing energy where we produce food. Now, there is a million ways of doing this. I focused here on two. One, which is super hard to pronounce, aglectric farms, and the other one is aquaculture. So the idea of aglectric farms, it's pretty straightforward. It's to build solar panels in areas where we are growing food. The problem, of course, is that both crops and solar panels need sunlight. So you need to make sure that both get the sunlight they need. And this can be done in many ways. Existing solar materials, the ones I'm showing you here, can be implemented, for example, by allowing to have a part of the solar panel that is transparent and a part that is where there are cells that create electricity, and this way the light goes through the transparent part into the crops, and then it's diffused by a further mechanism. Or another possible solution is that of creating a vertical solar panel, which then in turn creates a line shadow rather than a bigger shadow, and then moving it around throughout the day so that each plant gets a bit less light, but not that much less. This is, of course, in this case, the main goal is reducing shadow to a minimum. Another solution, which I think it's super cool actually, it's instead of negotiating who gets what light, how much light, you can just split the solar spectrum, and so that plants get the photons that they need for the photosynthesis, whereas photovoltaic cells get the infrared infrared section of the sunlight they need to produce electricity. In this way, each gets what they need, and we're all happy after. Here, I have I'm showing you two mechanisms that can allow for this, and if done properly, it can also be used to light during winter greenhouses, as shown in the second picture, the picture number F. And so it can increase not only land use efficiency, but it can also create systems that are able to grow food both in winter and in summer just with sunlight. There you go. This is an example of an electric farm that you can see here in the picture. Finally, aquaculture, super straightforward. We have just spent most of my time talking about how offshore energy infrastructure can create a suitable environment for wildlife to live. So of course, then the question is, we can also grow wildlife there to reduce the pressure on fisheries that we put every day through fishing. And of course, energy installations can provide a space where this can be done because they provide a narrow reach of artificial reef that encourages the growth of marine life. No trolling zones, which are protected from boats and anyone else who's fishers, but also from just the circulation of boats in general. And also the various pillars provide a series of anchor points that can facilitate the management of the aquaculture facility. So this is more or less everything that I wanted to talk about to you today. I reckon I didn't go too much into detail, given both the time and also the fact that I think this gives you a lot of opportunity to expand if you're interested on any of the specific topics. So thank you very much for your attention. And I guess, Paul, I leave you some space for the conclusions.
Thanks. I was just watching. There was one question in the chat about like the extended the non-trolling zones on the offshore wind farms. I don't know if you have came across this during your research, Pietro. If I just Googled, I have a few things to say, but I don't know if this is something you saw.
No, there wasn't any specific requirement on the exact dimension. I guess that also. Then I guess I can leave you the space to answer a bit more in detail this question. Although I do think that to some extent, it can also be considered, of course, a political question to the extent of how much do we want to, what is the final goal of the no-tolling zone that we are instituting around the energy installation. Because of course, if the goal is protecting wildlife, it can be expanded to a further extent. If the goal is just ensuring that the infrastructure remains safe, it can probably be smaller, but I'll leave you the floor.
Yeah, so what I understand very quickly after a short Google research is that there should be so each windmill, again, that depends on the size, but let's say that the standard offshore windmill have to be spaced by 50 meters each, and then there is like a 500 meters radius around the transformer, so the one that all the windmills are connected to, and then around the entire zone there seems to be a 500 meters safety zones. And so basically the actual size of the protected area depends on the number of windmills, but to this number you can add first a 50 meters safety zones where the boats are not allowed to go at all, and then an extra 500 meters where the activities are forbidden, such as fishing. So yeah, that's to answer your question. We're just about to wrap up. The one last thing I wanted to say, because it was asked in the form that we sent, someone asked basically how we could possibly ensure that biofuel production is consistent with our biodiversity objectives. Even though we touched upon it several times, I wanted to sort of mention that one way to do it, and it is already the case in the Renewable Energy Directive, is that there are certain criteria that are set for the way biofuels need to be produced. So first of all, the states have a mandatory amount of biofuels that they need to add in the transportation mix. That means that the entire transportation fuels needs to have at least, I think, 5% of biofuels. And of these 5%, a certain amount has to be produced in what they call the sustainable way. And from what I remember, they are very stringent criteria on how these fuels have to be produced. And one way, for instance, is to ensure that the fuels mostly come from agricultural or urban waste. So that means that this is anyway something that would be discarded and wouldn't be used anyway. And then the second way is coming back to what I was talking about at the beginning, the idea of land use. And the point is that the Renewable Energy Directive forbids the indirect change of land use, meaning that in order to get this 5% of mandatory biofuels, the states needs to be ensured that they are not coming from lands that were previously cropland for feedstock or for human farmings, and that have been then changed into cropland for biofuel generation.